Scotland is not the homeland of the Celts. Ireland is not the homeland of the Celts. Wales, with all its dragons and druids and ancient stone memory, is not the homeland of the Celts. The people the world most closely associates with bagpipes and shamrocks and ancient mysticism actually came from the dead center of Europe, from mountain valleys in what is now Austria and Switzerland, from salt mines and iron forges and chieftain graves buried under mounds of earth, from a world that had nothing to do with the Atlantic coast we picture when someone says the word Celtic. And here is the thing that makes this stranger still. The people we call Celts never called themselves that. They didn't think of themselves as one people. They had no single king, no unified empire, no capital city. They were hundreds of tribes spread across thousands of miles who happened to share a family of languages, a way of building a society, a set of gods they argued over, and a relationship with the world of the dead that most of us, even now, haven't quite shaken loose. The Greeks gave them the name Keltoi, which translates roughly to the shouty ones. The Romans called them barbarians. History called them savages. But here's what history forgot to mention. These people sacked Rome. These people turned half of Europe into their backyard. These people built a civilization so deep and so strange that fragments of it are still alive right now, in the languages spoken on the western edge of the British Isles, in the holidays we celebrate without knowing why, in the word "to" itself. This is the story of the Celts, where they came from, what they believed, what their priests did in the darkness of the oak forests, and why, after 2,000 years of being pushed to the edge of the world, they never quite disappeared. If this already has your brain firing, hit that like button. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. And also, write in the comments where you're watching us from. I'm really curious. What time is it there? And what kind of video would you like to see next? So, let's go back. Not to Ireland, not to Scotland. Let's go back to a place called Hallstatt, in what is now Austria, on the western bank of a cold lake surrounded by mountains. The year is somewhere around 700 years before the birth of Christ, and something extraordinary is happening here. Something that will eventually produce the first Celts that archaeologists can actually identify with confidence. The people of Hallstatt are sitting on top of one of the most valuable resources in the ancient world: salt. Not the kind you shake onto your fries. Salt as a matter of life and death. Because in a world without refrigerators, without preservatives, without any way to keep meat from rotting, salt was the only thing standing between civilization and starvation. The Hallstatt people controlled the mines. They controlled the trade routes, and the wealth that flowed in from that control made certain families extraordinarily powerful. When archaeologists began digging up the graves of these Hallstatt chieftains in the 19th century, what they found stunned them. Bronze vessels imported from the Mediterranean, gold jewelry of a craftsmanship that rivaled anything the Greeks were making, silk, presumably traded all the way from China. These were not primitive people eking out a living in the forest. These were wealthy elites, connected to the wider ancient world through trade networks that stretched from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. They were also the first users of iron in much of Europe, and that matters enormously. Because iron changes warfare the way the internet changed communication. Suddenly, you could make weapons that were harder, sharper, and more plentiful than anything bronze could produce. The Hallstatt warriors moved through neighboring peoples the way a current moves through still water. Not necessarily always through conquest, sometimes through trade, sometimes through alliance, sometimes through cultural influence so strong that surrounding peoples simply started doing what the Hallstatt people did. But always, the iron was there. Always, the wealth was there. And always, this particular way of organizing the world. The chieftain at the top, the priests just below, the warriors below that, the farmers and craftsmen and traders filling out the rest, spread with it. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated, and where historians have been arguing for a century and a half. Who were the Celts? Really? Were the Hallstatt people Celtic? Were they Proto-Celtic? Did the Celtic language emerge from their culture or from somewhere else entirely? The honest answer is that no one completely agrees. There are three main theories, and all three have serious scholars behind them. The oldest theory, which was dominant for most of the 20th century, says that Celtic culture and language grew out of the Urnfield and Hallstatt cultures of Central Europe and spread outward from there, east to west, north to south, the way a wave spreads from a stone dropped in still water. The second theory, built on newer DNA evidence and linguistic analysis, says that the Celtic languages actually originated much further west, along the Atlantic coast, in the areas that are now Spain, Portugal, Britain, and Ireland, and that the Hallstatt connection is real, but less central than we thought. A third theory, offered more recently by the scholar Patrick Sims Williams, splits the difference and places the original emergence of the Proto-Celtic language somewhere in Gaul, in what is now France, from which it spread in multiple directions at once. What all three theories agree on is this. By around 800 years before the Common Era, there were people in Europe speaking languages we would recognize as Celtic. By 500 years before the Common Era, those people were on the move. And by the time Rome sat up and paid attention, the Celts were everywhere. Let me put that in terms you can feel. Imagine starting from Austria. Now expand outward until you've covered most of France. Keep going. Into Spain, into Britain, into Ireland. Up into Denmark, down into northern Italy, east into Bohemia and the modern Czech Republic, further east into what is now Romania and Bulgaria, and then, somehow, impossibly, all the way to the coast of Turkey, where a group called the Galatians built a Celtic kingdom in Anatolia and actually stayed there for centuries. That's the territory we're talking about. Not an empire. Empires have capitals, they have legions, they have tax collectors. This was something more like a cultural explosion, a slow-motion eruption that took hundreds of years and left this particular set of ideas, this particular way of seeing the world, scattered across a continent like seeds from an explosion. But before we get to what those ideas were, before we get to the druids and the gods and the human sacrifices in the fog, we need to talk about the moment that made the ancient world sit up and realize that these people were not something to dismiss. The year is 390 years before the Common Era. Rome at this point is not yet the empire that will eventually rule the known world. It's a city-state, powerful, proud, increasingly important in central Italy, but not yet the Rome of the Colosseum and the legions and the emperors. Rome thinks highly of itself. Rome is building something. Rome believes, with the particular certainty that young powers always believe, that it is the future. Then the Celts arrive. A confederation of Celtic tribes has been pushing south into northern Italy for decades, drawn by the richness of the Italian peninsula, by the warmth, by the wine, by the simple fact that the world's wealth tends to flow toward the Mediterranean, and the Celts have always known how to follow wealth. They settle in the Po River Valley. They push further south. They come into conflict with the Etruscan cities, and eventually, through a cascade of diplomatic failures and battlefield miscalculations that we don't need to get lost in, they find themselves marching on Rome. The Roman army goes out to meet them at a place called the Alia River, about 11 miles from the city. What happens next is not a battle, it is a catastrophe. The Celts, under a high king whom the Romans recorded as Brennus, which was probably a title rather than a name, something like __quote _3 __ or __quote _4 __, hit the Roman lines with a ferocity the Romans were simply not prepared for. Celtic warriors fought in a way that terrified organized armies, loud, aggressive, hurling javelins and then charging with long swords, while screaming war cries designed to unnerve the enemy before contact was even made. Some of them fought naked, wearing nothing but their torques and their tattoos, as a kind of ultimate display of fearlessness. The Roman formation broke. The Roman soldiers ran. Many of them drowned in the Tiber trying to escape. The city of Rome was essentially open. The Celts walked in. They burned much of it. They held the city for months while a small group of Roman defenders held out on the Capitoline Hill, the fortified heart of the city, refusing to surrender. According to one of history's most famous stories, which may or may not be literally true, but certainly captures the feeling of the moment, the only reason Rome survived was a flock of sacred geese in the temple of Juno, whose honking woke the defenders when the Celts tried to climb the hill at night. Whether that specific story is accurate, what is absolutely certain is that the Celts eventually agreed to leave in exchange for payment in gold. And according to ancient accounts, when the Romans tried to negotiate over the weight of the gold being demanded, Brennus threw his sword onto the scales to add to the measure, and said, in words that echoed through Roman history forever afterward, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. 3 words. They captured everything about how the Celts saw the world, and everything about what Rome feared about them. Rome never forgot this moment. For the next 2 centuries, Celtic tribes in northern Italy would be called the Gaulish threat, and that specific trauma, that specific fear of the barbaric north descending on civilization, would shape Roman foreign policy for generations. Julius Caesar would eventually use the memory of it as political justification for his brutal conquest of Gaul. The sack of Rome was that scarring. But here's the thing about the Celts. They didn't follow up on their advantage. They didn't build an empire from the ruins of Rome. They took their gold and they left. They went home. Because that's not how the Celts thought about power. They weren't empire builders. They were something more complicated, and in many ways more interesting than that. Celtic society was built around the tribe, the extended family network, the clan, the kin group that you were born into and that defined almost everything about your life. At the head of each tribe was a chief or king, chosen through a combination of heredity and demonstrated ability. If a king proved weak or unlucky, he could be replaced, because the health of the tribe depended on the health of its leader. Below the king were the nobles, the warrior class, the people who owned land and horses and weapons, who competed with each other for status and favor through feasts and gift-giving, and, when necessary, through fighting. Below them, the craftsmen, the farmers, the free people who made up the bulk of Celtic society, and below them, the slaves, though the Celtic attitude toward slavery was somewhat more flexible than the Roman or Greek models, with slaves able to earn or buy their freedom under certain conditions. What made Celtic society genuinely distinctive, what made Greek and Roman observers rub their eyes in disbelief, was where women fit into this structure. In classical Greece, women were essentially property. They stayed indoors. They didn't speak in public. They had no political voice and very limited legal standing. Rome was somewhat more progressive, but not dramatically so. But Celtic women, at least in many Celtic societies, could own property. They could divorce. They could inherit and pass on wealth. They could serve as warriors. They could become queens and lead armies. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus described the Gaulish women as physically formidable and not at all shy about fighting alongside their husbands. Strabo made similar observations. Ancient Celtic law texts from Ireland, some of the oldest legal codes in European history, describe a world where women's rights were codified and protected in ways that wouldn't reappear in European law for well over 1,000 years. Wear the torque, and you understood it. The torque, that twisted, open-ended ring of gold or bronze or silver worn around the neck, was the single most powerful status symbol in Celtic culture. It marked you as someone, a warrior who'd proven themselves, a noblewoman of standing, a king. The weight of it against your throat was a reminder every moment of the day of where you stood in the world and what you owed the people below you. To receive a torque was to be seen. To lose it, through defeat, through dishonor, through death, was to cease to be someone. Warriors went into battle wearing their torques. Chieftains were buried with them. The goddess Epona, patron of horses, wore one. The Morrigan, the crow-shaped goddess of war and fate, was associated with them. The torque is so distinctly, so completely Celtic, that archaeologists use its presence in a grave to identify the culture, the way an American flag in a painting tells you something about the era and the meaning. And then there are the druids. If any aspect of Celtic civilization has been more thoroughly mythologized, more thoroughly misunderstood, more thoroughly turned into something it wasn't, by 19th century romantics, by 20th century New Age movements, by popular culture at large, it is the druids. People picture white robes and Stonehenge and crystals and moon ceremonies. The reality is both more mundane and far more extraordinary. The druids were the intellectual class of Celtic society. They were the priests, yes, but they were also the judges, the lawyers, the historians, the astronomers, the doctors, the political advisors, the teachers. In a society with no universities, no courts, no written legal codes, no libraries, the druids were all of those things at once, walking repositories of everything the tribe needed to know in order to function. Julius Caesar, who had excellent reasons to make the druids seem dangerous and powerful, since he was in the middle of conquering the people they led, and justifying that to Rome required a narrative, described them in his account of the Gallic Wars with both contempt and something that reads very much like grudging respect. He noted that they were exempt from military service and from paying taxes. He noted that many young men flocked to study with them because those privileges were significant. He noted that they held annual gatherings at a sacred site in the heart of Gaul to settle disputes between tribes. That they functioned, in other words, as something like a pan-Celtic judiciary. And he noted, with some bafflement, that they deliberately refused to write any of their knowledge down. This last point is worth sitting with. The druids spent up to 20 years, memorizing everything. Every law, every ritual, every myth, every genealogy, every piece of astronomical knowledge about the movements of the sun and stars. They used the Greek alphabet for everyday purposes, for commerce and communication, but the sacred knowledge, the core of what made them druids, existed only in memory. Caesar interpreted this as a way of restricting access, keeping power concentrated in the hands of those who'd done the work. Modern scholars have offered another interpretation, that for the Celts, the spoken word had a power that writing could never capture, that a truth spoken aloud, in the presence of witnesses, had a living force that marks on a surface could not, that their oral tradition was not a failure to achieve literacy, but a deliberate philosophical choice about the nature of knowledge itself. One of the most striking things Caesar reported about druidic power, and it was confirmed by other ancient writers, was that if a druid stepped between two armies on the point of battle, both sides would stop fighting. Just stop. Even in the heat of combat, even with blood already on the ground, the appearance of a druid in the space between the lines was enough to freeze everything. Think about what that tells you about the authority these people commanded, not just within a single tribe, between enemies. The druid was literally above the conflict, above the political, above the martial, above the personal. That kind of authority doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from a shared belief, running so deep through the culture that it overrides self-preservation. The Celts believed in their priests the way we almost don't believe in anything anymore. And what did the priests believe in? The Celtic religious universe was enormous. Over 400 distinct deities have been identified across the various Celtic cultures, though many of them were local gods, worshipped by a single tribe or in a single valley, their names surviving only in inscriptions that no one alive has ever heard spoken. What unified the whole system was not a single theology or a single creation myth, but a set of shared assumptions about how the world worked. The world was alive. Every river had a spirit. Every oak tree, and oak trees were particularly sacred, was inhabited. Every hill, every crossroads, every well where water emerged from the earth as if from nowhere, was a threshold, a place where this world and the world below pressed close together, and where offerings could pass between them. The great gods, the ones who appear across multiple Celtic cultures and whose names survived into the myths that Christian monks wrote down in medieval Ireland, were figures of extraordinary complexity. Take the Dagda, __quote_6___, which in Celtic terms doesn't mean morally good, it means comprehensively good, meaning skilled at everything. The Dagda was enormous, pot-bellied, wrapped in a short tunic that barely covered him, dragging behind him a club so massive it required wheels to move. With one end of that club he could kill 9 men. With the other end, he could bring the dead back to life. He had a cauldron that no one ever left hungry. He had a harp, and this harp was not a decorative object. When the Dagda played it, the seasons changed. When he played it, the emotions of every person within earshot shifted, whether they wanted them to or not. He was loud, ridiculous, powerful, generous, and terrifying, and the Celts loved him for all of it. Or take the Morrigan. She is harder to love, and she knows it. The Phantom Queen, the Great Queen,
the goddess of war
and fate and death. But more specifically, the goddess of the moment before you know which way a battle is going to go, that suspended instant where everything hangs on the balance. She appeared on battlefields as a crow, or as a raven, or sometimes as a beautiful woman who tested warriors to see whether they deserved to live. She came to the great hero Cuchulainn in that form, offered him her love, her protection, her power. He didn't recognize her. He refused. And when he died in battle, it was a crow that settled on his shoulder and told the world the fight was over. The Morrigan doesn't forgive slights. She doesn't comfort. She shows up when the dice are falling and watches to see how you meet your fate. In Irish mythology, she is everywhere that death is, and the Celts found her not monstrous, but necessary, honest. The world has a Morrigan in it. Better to name her than to pretend otherwise. Then there is Cernunnos, the Horned One, the Lord of Wild Things, the god who sits cross-legged in the forest with antlers growing from his head and a torque around his neck, and animals gathered around him like he is the still center of all living things. He appears on the Gundestrup cauldron, one of the most extraordinary artifacts from the ancient Celtic world, surrounded by stags and serpents, a figure of such primal strangeness that scholars have argued for a century about exactly what he meant. He seems to be associated with fertility, with the abundance of the natural world, with the hunt, with the cycle of growth and death and growth again. He is also associated with the underworld, with the passage between this life and whatever comes next, with the particular knowledge that comes only from having stood at the edge of things. And this brings us to what the Celts believed about death, because their cosmology of death is one of the most remarkable things about them, and it is the key to understanding almost everything else. The Celts were not afraid of dying. This is not rhetorical. It is something that multiple ancient writers noted with genuine amazement, because in the ancient world, that was genuinely unusual. Greek warriors fought bravely, but they feared Hades. Roman soldiers faced death stoically because duty demanded it. But Celtic warriors charged into battle with the particular fearlessness of people who did not believe that death ended anything important, because they didn't believe that. What the druids taught, and Caesar confirmed this, and it was confirmed by the Irish myths written down centuries later, was that the soul was immortal. When a person died, the soul left the body and traveled to the other world, a realm that the Celts described with remarkable consistency as a place of abundance and beauty, where no one grew old, no one suffered from disease, no one went hungry, and where 100 years passed like a single day. The dead were not gone, they were just elsewhere, and that elsewhere was connected to this world through thin places, rivers, springs, ancient hills, the night of Samhain, where the living and the dead could almost touch. This is why Celtic burials are so extraordinary. When a Celtic chieftain died, they were buried with everything they would need on the other side. In the great Hallstatt graves and Latin princely burials, archaeologists have found chariots, gold torques, drinking vessels for feasting, and this matters because Celtic feasting was not just eating, It was the primary social ritual of the culture, the way you demonstrated your status and generosity and belonging. They were buried with weapons, with their horses, with their dogs, with their gaming pieces, because why would a person not want to play games in the other world? And, in some of the earliest and most elite graves, with the slaves and attendants who had served them in life, killed at burial so they could continue serving. The other world was called many things in different Celtic traditions. In Ireland, it was Tir na Nog, the land of the young, or Mag Mell, the delightful plain. In Wales, it was Anwen. In Gaul, it was simply the other side. But the description is consistent across all of them. A land with no sickness, no old age, no death. A land where food is endless and music never stops. A land that is, in many ways, the world we have but perfected, the world as it should be. The ancient Irish believed the entrances to this land were the great mounds they found throughout the Irish landscape. Burial mounds so old they predated the Celts themselves. They believed the Tuatha De Danann, the divine race, the people of the goddess Danu, who were the gods of pre-Christian Ireland, had retreated into these mounds when the human world became too loud, and were still there, just beneath the surface, just behind the thin membrane between worlds. The Celtic relationship to death shaped everything about how they lived. It made them fierce in battle, not reckless, but genuinely unafraid, with the particular courage of people who believe that what comes next is better than what they're leaving. It shaped their festivals. Samhain, which falls on the 1st of November, was the night when the membrane went thinnest, when the dead could walk among the living, when the old year died and the new year hadn't yet been born, when everything was in suspension and the normal rules didn't apply. The Celts lit great bonfires on that night to guide the dead and to keep away what shouldn't come through. They left food out. They dressed in costumes to confuse the spirits that might have unfinished business with the living. Samhain is, of course, what became Halloween, and the next time you carve a pumpkin or put on a mask, you are doing something that Celtic people were doing more than 2,000 years ago, in fields lit by fire, on the edge of a world they believed was only the visible surface of something much deeper. But if the Celts believed in a beautiful afterlife, if their druids were philosophers and astronomers and walking law libraries, if their society gave women rights that Greek and Roman women could barely imagine, then what do we do with the human sacrifice? Because we have to talk about it. The Romans talked about it constantly, and while they had obvious reasons to make the Celts look savage, they were in the business of conquering them and needed to justify that to the civilized world. The evidence goes well beyond Roman propaganda. It is archaeological. It is forensic. It is as real as the body of a man found in a peat bog in Cheshire, England, sometime in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, preserved so perfectly by the chemistry of the bog that scientists could analyze the contents of his last meal. That man is called Lindo Man. He was found in 1984 by workers cutting peat from Lindo moss, and when they found him, he was so perfectly preserved that the foreman initially thought they'd found a recent murder victim. Lindo Man's last meal was a charred grain cake. He was in his mid-20s, well-built, with manicured fingernails, suggesting a person of some status, not a slave, not a criminal. And he was killed 3 times, strangled, hit on the head with sufficient force to fracture his skull, and then his throat was cut. Not because it took 3 attempts, but because the killing had to be complete, final, performed from 3 directions simultaneously. Archaeologists call this the triple death. It appears in Celtic mythology too, the ritual killing that must be done a certain number of ways, in a certain order, to be acceptable to the gods. Julius Caesar, who had seen these ceremonies with his own eyes, described a ritual that still startles even now. The druids, he wrote, believed that the gods required human lives in exchange for human lives, that when someone in the tribe was gravely ill, or when disaster threatened, or when battle made the stakes high enough, the only currency that could move the divine world was a human soul freely offered. And when criminals or prisoners of war were available, they preferred those. But when they weren't, and here is where it gets uncomfortable, the innocent would do. Caesar described what he called the wicker man, a vast figure of wood and wicker, shaped like a human being and filled with living people, animals, criminals, prisoners, and then set on fire. Whether Caesar was accurately describing something he witnessed or embellishing a story he'd heard at third hand is a question historians debate. But the archaeology confirms that ritual killings happened. The bog bodies across northwestern Europe, dozens of them preserved in peat, many showing signs of ritualized violence, tell a story that Roman propaganda alone cannot explain. What were the Celts trying to do? The same thing every ancient religion was trying to do: maintain the relationship between the human world and the divine one. Keep the gods appeased, keep the world turning, keep the harvest coming and the cattle healthy, and the wars going in your favor. The Celts were not uniquely brutal. The Romans sacrificed humans too, until they decided it was barbaric to do so, at which point they used gladiatorial games, which amounted to the same thing with better production values. But the Celtic method was specific. It was deliberate. It was embedded in a theology that saw death not as an end, but as a gift. The soul freed from its body, sent to the other world to speak on behalf of the living, to carry their prayers across the threshold that the living couldn't cross. The druids understood something that is easy to lose in the horror of the particulars, that the relationship between the living and the dead, between the human world and the divine one, to take something from the human world and give it to the divine. The Celts gave rivers. They gave weapons, extraordinary weapons, some of the finest metalwork in the ancient world, bent and broken and thrown into bogs and lakes as offerings, too precious to use and too important to keep. They gave animals and grain and their own blood, and sometimes, in the most extreme circumstances, they gave a life, not out of cruelty, out of the conviction that the cosmos demanded reciprocity. This is a hard thing to hold in your mind, that a people who believed deeply in the beauty of the afterlife, who loved feasts and music and the swirling patterns of gold and bronze, who gave their women rights that the Greeks never imagined, who developed one of the most sophisticated oral legal systems in the ancient world, also did this. But history is full of people who were simultaneously magnificent and terrible. The Celts were no different. And maybe what makes them so persistently fascinating, 2,000 years after the Romans did their best to erase them, is exactly this: that they refused to be simple, that they were both the beautiful interlacing patterns on the Gundestrup cauldron and the body in the bog, both the love song and the war cry, both the land of the young, where no one grows old, and the wicker man, burning against the night sky. But if you want to understand the Celts at their most complete, at their most tragic, their most fierce, their most irreducibly human, then we need to talk about a woman who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, in a tribe on the eastern coast of Roman-occupied Britain. Her name was Boudicca, and what was done to her, and what she did in response, is one of the most shattering stories in all of ancient history. The year is 60 of the Common Era. Rome has been in Britain for about 17 years, since the Emperor Claudius ordered the invasion in 43 CE. The conquest has been gradual, complicated, and in many parts of the island, deeply resented. Some tribes collaborated. They had no real choice, and the Romans could offer real benefits: trade, infrastructure, the protection of the most powerful military in the known world. One such tribe was the Iceni, in what is now the eastern part of England. Their king, a man named Prasutagus, had made an accommodation with Rome. He was a client king, nominally independent, answerable to the emperor, but governing his own people in his own way, so long as he kept the peace and didn't cause trouble. Prasutagus died in 60 CE. He left his kingdom and his wealth jointly to his 2 daughters and to the Emperor Nero, a careful political arrangement designed to keep Rome satisfied while protecting his family. It was reasonable, It was sensible. It was the kind of practical thinking that had kept the Iceni relatively unmolested for 17 years. Rome ignored it completely. The Roman financial agent sent to handle the estate treated Iceni territory not as a client kingdom making an orderly transition, but as a conquered province ripe for plunder. Iceni nobles had their estates confiscated. The dead king's relatives were treated as slaves. And Prasutagus' widow, this woman Boudicca, queen of the Iceni, was publicly flogged, stripped and beaten in front of her people, in front of her children.
And her 2 daughters, the heirs whom Prasutagus had tried to protect,
were raped by Roman soldiers. What happened next is the reason you know her name. Boudicca raised an army, not a ragtag mob, an army. The Iceni, outraged beyond endurance, were joined by the neighboring Trinovantes tribe, who had their own long list of grievances against Roman arrogance. Other tribes joined. What assembled was a force that ancient sources put somewhere between 100,000 and 240,000 people, a number that may be exaggerated, but whatever the true figure, it was large enough to change the course of Roman history in Britain. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was away, on the island of Anglesey off the northwest coast of Wales, doing what the Romans always did with druids, trying to eradicate them. He was burning the sacred groves, killing the priests, silencing the last voices of the old religion. He was, in other words, occupied with destroying the spiritual heart of Celtic Britain, while the political heart of Celtic Britain was assembling into something terrible. Boudicca's army moved first on Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the oldest Roman city in Britain, a symbol of imperial arrogance, where veterans lived on stolen Iceni land, and where Rome had built a temple to the dead Emperor Claudius at the local population's expense. The city fell. It burned. The few soldiers defending it were overwhelmed. The Roman 9th Legion marched to relieve the city, and was routed, its infantry destroyed, its commander fleeing with cavalry remnants to wherever he could find cover. Londinium, London, was next. By this point, Suetonius had raced back from Wales, done the brutal calculation, decided that the city couldn't be defended with the forces he had, and evacuated south. He left behind everyone who couldn't or wouldn't move. Roman ancient accounts say those people begged him to stay. He marched away anyway. And Boudicca's army arrived and burned the city to the ground. Archaeologists working in central London have found the evidence. A distinctive layer of burned debris, ash and destruction compressed into the earth at the same level in every excavation in the old Roman city. Boudicca was there. The fire was real. Then Verulamium, St. Albans, fell in the same way. 3 cities, tens of thousands dead. The Roman province of Britannia on the verge of collapse. And standing at the center of all of it, on a chariot, with red hair that Cassius Dio says fell to her hips, wearing a tunic of many colors and a great golden torque around her throat, was a woman who had been beaten by Rome and decided that the only answer was to burn everything Rome had built. The ancient historian Tacitus, whose account is the most detailed we have, imagined the speech Boudicca gave to her forces before the final confrontation. He wrote, "She told them that she was not fighting as a queen, defending wealth and power. She was fighting as a person, as one of the people, avenging their freedom, their ravaged bodies, their outraged children. She told them, the gods favored righteous vengeance. She told them, win or die. She told them, this was the day that determined whether they lived as Britons or perished as slaves. And then she drove her chariot along the line of her army, something we know was a real Celtic practice, the chieftain or queen moving before her forces before battle, and the sound of 250,000 throats raised together would have been enough to shake the ground. Suetonius chose his battlefield carefully. He was outnumbered by a ratio that made the outcome seem predetermined. He needed terrain that would neutralize the size advantage, a narrow defile with forest at his back, open ground in front, where Celtic numbers couldn't spread out and envelop his flanks. He found it somewhere in the British Midlands, though no one has ever definitively established exactly where. His army was perhaps 10,000 men. Boudicca's was enormous. She parked her wagons in a great semicircle behind her own lines, her families, her children, her people, there to witness the victory they were certain was coming. It was the worst tactical decision she made, because when the Romans broke the charge, when their disciplined formation and the narrowness of the ground absorbed the initial shock and then pushed back, Boudicca's army couldn't retreat. The wagons were in the way. They were trapped between the Roman legions and their own people. What followed was a slaughter. Boudicca survived the battlefield, but not for long. Tacitus says she took poison rather than be captured, rather than be paraded through Rome in chains, rather than give the empire the spectacle of her defeat. Cassius Dio says she fell ill and died. Either way, she was gone, and with her went the last real chance of Celtic Britain throwing off Roman rule. The Romans did not respond to the rebellion gently. Suetonius spent months extracting revenge, burning crops, hunting down survivors, making an example of every tribe that had participated. It was only when a new administrator arrived from Rome and calculated that you couldn't extract tax revenue from a dead population that the policy shifted towards something closer to order. But Boudicca was not erased. She couldn't be. She had nearly broken the empire's grip on an island. The Roman historians who wrote about her did so with a mixture of horror and something else, something that reads like respect that couldn't quite be suppressed. Tacitus gave her a speech. Cassius Dio described her physical appearance in detail, her height, her eyes, her voice, which he called harsh. These are not the details you bother recording about someone you want to dismiss. And she survived. Through the centuries, through the Norman conquest and the medieval period and the Renaissance, her story was passed down in fragments. When scholars rediscovered the Roman accounts in the 16th century, she became something new, an icon. A symbol of British resistance to foreign domination, which was convenient for a queen named Elizabeth, who also ruled an island kingdom and also needed to demonstrate that women could be formidable. The Victorians built a massive bronze statue of Boudicca on her chariot, right next to the Houses of Parliament in London, with her daughters beside her and her arms raised as if she's still charging. It stands there now, a few minutes' walk from Westminster Bridge, the queen of a people Rome tried to erase, standing in stone at the heart of a city she once burned. That is who the Celts were. Not the ancient inhabitants of one island, but a civilization that once stretched across a continent. Not the peaceful mystics of modern imagination, but something more complex and more human. Warriors who feared nothing, priests who carried 1,000 years of knowledge in their heads without writing a word of it down. Artists who created work of almost unbearable beauty, a people who believed that death was a beginning and that the world of the living and the world of the dead pressed so close together that you could, on certain nights, hear one from the other. They built no Colosseum. They wrote no epics, or if they did, those epics were memorized and then forgotten when the people who knew them were killed. They left behind torques and bog bodies and place names, and the slow-burning fire of languages that Rome couldn't quite put out. They left behind Samhain, which we celebrate without knowing its name. They left behind the idea of the other world, a land without sickness or sorrow, somewhere just past the edge of sight, which is one of the oldest, most persistent, most human dreams there is. And they left behind the ghost of Boudicca, still driving her chariot through the November dark, red-haired and gold-throated, crying something the Romans tried for 2,000 years to mishear. But let's step back from the smoking ruins of London for a moment, because the destruction of Boudicca's revolt, as dramatic and final as it seems, was not actually the killing blow to Celtic Britain. The killing blow came earlier, and it came in a different place entirely, against a different kind of power. It came on a narrow strip of water off the coast of Wales, on a morning in 60 CE, when a Roman army crossed over to an island and did something that left a scar so deep that the Celtic world never quite healed from it. The island was called Mona. We know it now as Anglesey, a small island off the northwest coast of Wales, separated from the mainland by a channel so narrow that in places you could almost shout across it. Today, it's famous for its sandy beaches and its medieval castle at Beaumaris. But in the 1st century CE, it was something else entirely. It was the last sanctuary, the last place where the druids had gathered in sufficient numbers to matter, the last beating heart of the old religion, the last place in Roman-occupied Britain where the intellectual class of Celtic civilization had concentrated itself, determined to survive, determined to continue. When the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus made the decision to cross to Anglesey, he was not making a purely military calculation. He was making a cultural one.
He understood what the druids were, not just priests, but organizers, coordinators, the people who could move between tribes and speak to all of them in a common language of authority, who could stand between two armies and stop them fighting, who could call for a pan-Celtic resistance in a way that no single chieftain or king could. He had watched the druids functioning as the spiritual glue holding Celtic resistance together, and he had decided, with the particular cold logic of empire, that the glue had to go. He built flat-bottomed boats to handle the shallows of the Menai Strait. He moved his legions west through Wales, drawing on the same infrastructure of force that was, at that very moment, stripping the Iceni of their lands 700 miles away. And when his army reached the shore opposite Anglesey, what they found on the other bank made hardened soldiers stop. Tacitus described it. He was not there himself. His father-in-law Agricola was, and would later describe the scene to him. But what Tacitus recorded is one of the most vivid passages in ancient historical writing. On the far shore, he wrote, stood a dense mass of armed warriors, and among them, in the gaps between the fighters, stood women dressed in funeral black, hair loose and wild, carrying torches, moving through the lines like something out of a nightmare, like the Furies, he said, like the avenging spirits of myth made flesh. And surrounding them all, with their hands raised to the sky, stood the druids, pouring out curses on the Roman soldiers in waves, hurling their imprecations across the water with an intensity that Tacitus admitted froze the Roman legions in place. These trained soldiers, these men who had fought all over the known world, stood on their bank of the Menai Strait and could not move. Something about what they saw, the women with the fire, the priests with their raised hands, the sound of it, the sheer strangeness of it against the gray Welsh sky, locked their legs and silenced them. Then the officers pushed them forward. Then the training reasserted itself. Then the legions crossed. What followed was not a battle so much as a massacre. The druids, for all their authority, were not primarily fighters. The warriors protecting them fell. The black-robed women with their torches were cut down. And the druids, the ones who had carried 20 years of memorized knowledge in their heads, the ones who were the living libraries of Celtic civilization, the ones who knew every law and every myth and every astronomical observation their culture had accumulated, were killed. After the fighting, the soldiers went to work on something that troubled them more than combat. They destroyed the sacred groves. Every oak tree that the druids had sanctified, every clearing that had served as a temple, every altar and sacred pool and place of worship, leveled, burned, broken. The Romans understood that what they were doing was not just military violence. It was the deliberate destruction of a culture's memory. And then the news came from the east. Boudicca had risen. The province was in flames. Suetonius had to leave, had to abandon Anglesey before the job was truly finished, had to march his army back through Wales and south to confront the rebellion that he himself had indirectly triggered by stripping the island's defenses. The druids who survived scattered. Some went north. Some crossed the sea to Ireland, which Rome never managed to conquer, carrying with them the fragments of what they'd memorized, the remnants of 20 years of learning. looking for a place where the old knowledge could still breathe. The Romans came back to Anglesey 17 years later under Gnaeus Julius Agricola and finished what Suetonius had started. This time there was no Boudicca to interrupt them. Agricola's forces landed and scoured the island clean. There is a lake on Anglesey called Llyn Cerrig Bach, the Lake of the Little Rocks. And in the 1940s, during construction of a wartime airfield, workers pulling peat from the ground began to find things. Iron swords, bent and broken before being thrown in, spearheads, chariot fittings, cauldron fragments, bronze trumpets, gang chains for slaves. More than 150 objects pulled from what had been a lake at the edge of a bog. They had been deposited there over centuries, from the 2nd century before the Common Era right up to the 1st century after it. Right up to, in other words, the moment Rome came. Many of them had been deliberately damaged before they were offered to the water, broken so they could no longer be used in the human world, given to the gods intact in spirit, if not in form. The collection sits now in the National Museum of Wales. It is the nearest thing we have to the sound of what was lost. So, Boudicca was defeated. Anglesey was scoured. The druids were gone, or underground.
The Gallic Wars. Let's go back there for a moment, because they represent the other great catastrophe, the one that happened a century before Boudicca, the one that set the template for everything that followed. Julius Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 before the Common Era with the armies of Rome and the particular ambition of a man who understood that military success in the provinces translated directly into political power at home. Gaul, roughly modern France, Belgium, and Switzerland, was Celtic territory, populated by dozens of tribes who were culturally Celtic, who spoke Celtic languages, who worshipped Celtic gods, who had their druids meeting annually at the sacred center of Gaul in the territory of the Carnutes tribe. Caesar spent 8 years fighting them. Not because they were easy opponents, they weren't. Celtic warriors remained formidable. At the Battle of Gergovia in 52 BCE, a Gallic coalition led by a young Arvernian king named Vercingetorix came close to routing Caesar completely. The Romans took heavy losses. Caesar himself, by his own account, nearly ordered a retreat. Vercingetorix. That name is worth saying properly, worth letting it sit in the air for a moment, because he is one of the most remarkable figures in Celtic history, and one of the most tragic. He was born into the Arverni tribe, in what is now the volcanic highlands of central France, the Auvergne, which still bears a version of his people's name. His father had been killed by his own tribe for trying to make himself king. Vercingetorix grew up in a world of tribal division and Roman encroachment, watching Caesar's legions chew through one Celtic nation after another, while the tribes bickered among themselves about who to support and who to betray. He watched the Romans promise friendship and deliver chains. And at some point, in the winter of 52 BCE, when Caesar was still in Rome, he made a decision that no Celtic leader had been able to make before him. He united the Gauls. Not all of them. The divisions were too deep, the old grievances too fresh, the Roman loyalists too embedded in certain tribes. But enough of them. The Arverni, the Senones, the Parisii, the tribe whose name still echoes in the name of the city they lived beside, Paris, the Pictones, the Cadurci, dozens of Celtic tribes who had been fighting separately, who had been losing separately, came together under a single commander for the first time in Gallic history. Vercingetorix's strategy was not the old Celtic way of massing warriors and charging. It was patient, methodical, built on an understanding of logistics that his enemies had not expected from a, quote, 9 leader. Deny the Romans food. Burn your own towns rather than let Caesar use them as supply bases. Hit and run. Draw the legions into territory where their numbers and their discipline counted for less. The Celts, he told the tribes, had to play a different kind of war. For a while it worked. Gergovia was a Roman defeat so significant that Caesar minimized it in his own account, which is itself revealing. Caesar was not a man who enjoyed admitting failure. But ultimately, Vercingetorix made the choice that ended everything. He pulled his forces back to the fortified hilltop town of Alesia, a massive oppidum, a Celtic city fortress on a hill in what is now Burgundy in eastern France, and decided to hold it while sending for relief from the other Gallic tribes. Caesar responded with engineering. He built a double ring of siege works around Alesia, a wall facing inward to keep Vercingetorix in, and a wall facing outward to keep the relief army out. The thing Caesar built was 18 miles long on each side. The man contained an entire city inside a ring of Roman determination. The relief army came, hundreds of thousands of Celtic warriors throwing themselves against the outer Roman walls, while Vercingetorix's forces hammered against the inner ones. Caesar's forces, stretched impossibly thin, held both. The relief army failed, the besieged city starved, and Vercingetorix made one final decision. He rode out to surrender, alone, wearing his finest armor, on his finest horse. Tacitus doesn't describe this scene, but Plutarch does, or at least the tradition records it. The Celtic king riding in a great circle around Caesar's camp, in full battle dress, before dismounting and laying down his weapons at Caesar's feet. He said nothing. He asked for nothing. He simply surrendered with the dignity his culture demanded. Caesar threw him in a Roman dungeon and kept him there for 6 years. Then, when Caesar's political triumph in Rome required it, Vercingetorix was dragged out, paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, the great barbarian chieftain displayed for the Roman crowd's satisfaction, and strangled. It was 52 BCE to 46 BCE, 6 years of waiting in a cell for the man who had almost broken the greatest general of the ancient world. France, which had been Celtic, became Roman Gaul. The druids who had held the tribes together through their annual meeting at the sacred grove of the Carnutes were dispersed. The Gallic language, the Celtic tongue that had been spoken across what is now France for centuries, began the slow process of being replaced by vulgar Latin, the soldier's language, the conqueror's language, which would eventually become French. Today, a massive statue of Vercingetorix stands at Mont Auxois near Alesia. It was built in the 19th century by the French, who had rediscovered this Celt and decided, not without some irony, that he represented the spirit of French national resistance. The conqueror's language, built on the rubble of his own, put his name on a monument. The pattern held across Europe. Caesar in Gaul, Suetonius in Britain, Augustus pressing further, Claudius ordering the invasion of Britain. The empire moved west and north, and wherever it went, the organized Celtic world retreated. Not all at once. Resistance continued for decades, and in some places for a century. But by the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, the Druids were gone as an organized class. The great Celtic cultures of mainland Europe, the Gauls, the Celtiberians of Spain, the Galatians of Turkey, were absorbed into the Roman provincial world. Their people didn't vanish. Their genes didn't vanish. Their place names didn't vanish. Hundreds of European cities sit on foundations that have Celtic names, including Paris, Lyon, Geneva, Milan, Vienna, Belgrade. But their language died in those places, replaced by Latin. Their religion died, replaced first by Roman syncretism and then by Christianity. Their oral traditions, everything the Druids had memorized and refused to write down, were lost when the people who carried them in their heads were killed or scattered or simply ran out of people to pass the knowledge to. What survived did so in the places Rome couldn't reach. Ireland never fell to Rome. The legions looked across the Irish Sea and decided it wasn't worth it. Too far, too wet, too peripheral to the economic interests that drove Roman expansion. Ireland remained outside the empire's borders, and inside those borders the old Celtic world continued, almost undisturbed. The Druids who fled from Anglesey brought knowledge with them, the Irish mythological tradition, the great cycles of stories about the Tuatha De Danann, about the hero Cuchulainn and his impossible feats and his fatal pride, about the Morrigan watching from the branches, about Dagda playing his harp to call the seasons, survived there, transmitted from generation to generation by the same oral tradition the druids had always used. Centuries later, when Christian monks arrived in Ireland, not with armies but with books and faith, and a surprising willingness to record the old stories, even when they contradicted the new theology, they wrote down what they heard. The Book of the Dun Cow, the Book of Leinster, the Lebor Gabala Erin, the Book of the Taking of Ireland. These texts are among the oldest vernacular literature in Europe, and they are full of Celtic gods who had been demoted to heroes, Celtic cosmology that had been restructured to fit a Christian framework, Celtic stories that were just strange enough, just old enough, just beautiful enough that the monks couldn't bring themselves to leave them out. Scotland was never fully conquered either. The Romans built walls. Literally, they built walls to contain what they couldn't subdue. Hadrian's Wall stretches east to west across northern England, a physical line between the part of Britain Rome managed to hold and the part it didn't. North of that wall, the Picts, a Celtic people about whom we know frustratingly little because they left almost no written records, and very few of the Romans who encountered them survived to write much either, maintained their independence for centuries. Their art, carved in stone across the Scottish landscape, is some of the most distinctive and mysterious in the ancient world. Abstract symbols, animals in flowing motion, the same swirling Latin aesthetic applied to rock, speaking to us across more than 1,000 years in a visual language we still can't fully decode. Wales, pressed to the western edge of the island by the Roman occupation, and then by the Anglo-Saxon invasions that followed the collapse of Roman Britain, kept its language. Welsh is one of the oldest living languages in Europe. It has been spoken continuously in the hills and valleys of Wales for more than 1,000 years of recorded history, and considerably longer before that. There are people alive right now who speak Welsh as their first language, who dream in Welsh, who argue in Welsh, who raise their children in Welsh, and the language they speak is recognizably connected to the language spoken by the people of the Latin culture almost 2,500 years ago. When a Welsh speaker says dŵr for water, they are speaking a word whose root was already old when Caesar was alive. The continuity is not metaphorical, it is phonological, it is in the grammar. And then there's Ireland, where the language, Irish Gaelic, is the first official language of the Republic of Ireland, stamped on government documents and European Union treaties, where roughly 170,000 people still speak it as a daily language, clustered in communities along the western coast, the Gaeltacht regions, that look out over the same Atlantic that the Celts' most distant ancestors looked out over from the other side, where school children learn it as a required subject, where the street signs are bilingual, where the word Taoiseach, the title of the Irish Prime Minister, comes directly from an old Irish word for chieftain, the same kind of chieftain who wore a gold torque and commanded a Celtic war band 2,000 years ago. 6 Celtic languages survive today: Welsh, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Breton, spoken in the northwest corner of France, brought there by Britons fleeing the Anglo-Saxon invasions of England in the 5th and 6th centuries, which means that Celtic came back to continental Europe in the mouths of refugees. Cornish, which was declared extinct when its last native speaker died in 1777, and which has been revived by a community of dedicated speakers who learned a dead language and breathed it back to life. And Manx, from the Isle of Man, which went through the same near-death experience and the same resurrection. 2 languages that died and were brought back. In a world where languages vanish every decade, where the total number of human tongues shrinks generation by generation, the fact that people chose to learn a dead language, not for any practical reason, not because it made them richer or more employable, but because it was theirs, is one of the most genuinely moving things in the modern history of culture. But the Celtic legacy doesn't live only in the mouths of people who speak Celtic languages. It lives in things most Americans participate in, without any idea of where those things come from. Think about the 30th and 31st of October. Think about the costume you put on.
Think about the carved pumpkin, which is a New World substitution for the carved turnip that the Irish brought with them to America in the 1800s, because turnips were what you had in Ireland, and when you got to a land of pumpkins, you used pumpkins instead. Think about the bonfire, which is a literal quote, 12 the fire, into which animal bones were thrown as offering at Samhain. Think about the idea that on this particular night, the boundary between the living and the dead goes thin, that spirits are close, that wearing a disguise protects you from things that might otherwise recognize you. Every single one of those ideas comes from Samhain, from the Celtic feast of the dead, the night when the old year ended and the new year hadn't begun, when everything was betwixt and between, and the other world pressed close. Halloween is Samhain, not a distorted version of it, not a vague inspiration. The bones of the celebration, the disguises, the fire, the night of the dead, are unchanged. The costume you buy at Party City for your kid is, at its structural core, the same thing as the animal skin a Celtic farmer put on 2,000 years ago to confuse the spirits that walked the November dark. Or think about the idea of the cauldron, the witch's cauldron, the magic cauldron, the cauldron of transformation and death and rebirth. It runs through Western storytelling from the medieval Welsh tales of Bran the Blessed to the Arthurian legends, to Shakespeare's Macbeth, to Harry Potter. The Celts were obsessed with cauldrons. The Dagda's cauldron that never ran empty. The cauldron of regeneration in Welsh myth that could bring the dead back to life. But they came back without the power of speech, because death takes something that resurrection cannot restore. The Gundestrup cauldron in the National Museum of Denmark is one of the most remarkable objects from the ancient world. A large silver vessel covered in figures, Cernunnos seated with his animals, warriors dipping bodies into a vat of regeneration, gods and goddesses in procession. It was found in a Danish bog, deposited as an offering sometime around 2,000 years ago, and it is so packed with information about Celtic mythology that scholars have been reading it for a century and still argue about what it means. Or think about the idea of the other world itself, that place with no sickness, no death, no suffering, where the dead go and wait and feast and are happy. That idea is so deeply embedded in Western culture that most people assume it's universal, assume that all people have always believed something like it. But it isn't universal. The Greek afterlife was Hades, grim, dark, grey, a place of diminishment, where the dead were less than they'd been in life, where the great Achilles famously said he'd rather be the poorest slave on earth than king of the dead. The Norse afterlife divided between Valhalla for the honored warriors and a cold, unremarkable realm for everyone else. Only the Celtic tradition insisted consistently that the afterlife was better than this life, that death was not a reduction, that what waited on the other side of the thin place was abundance and joy and the end of suffering. The Irish who arrived in America in the 1800s, the million who crossed after the Great Famine of the 1840s, starving and broken, brought that idea with them. They brought Samhain and its disguises. They brought their music. They brought the melancholy and the dark wit and the sense of the world as a place where something beautiful has been lost, which is perhaps the oldest Celtic emotion of all, the sense that the other world is just out of reach, just past the edge of sight, and that the space between here and there is thin enough to feel, but not cross. That emotion runs through Irish literature from the medieval myths to W.B. Yeats, to James Joyce, to the songs of the immigrants who carried it across the Atlantic in the holds of ships and put it down in neighborhoods in Boston and New York and Chicago. And it is one of the most distinctive things about the way Irish America relates to grief and to beauty and to the dead. And those Irish Americans shaped Halloween into the form you celebrate now. They brought the traditions they carried from Ireland, the carved vegetables, the costumes, the bonfires, the sense of the night as charged with something, and they planted them in the New World soil. and a century of American commercial genius did the rest.
What you celebrate on October 31st is a direct line from a bonfire in Celtic Ireland more than 2,000 years ago. That's not poetry, that's history. There's one more thing that lives on from the Celts that I want to leave you with. It's not a holiday, or a language, or a piece of mythology. It's a habit of mind, a way of being in the world. The Celts never built an empire. They had every opportunity. They dominated a continent. They produced warriors that terrified Rome. They had the numbers, the iron, the ferocity, the organizational capacity of the druids. But they didn't build empires. They built tribes. They built communities. They built a culture organized around loyalty to the people you knew and the land you stood on, and the gods who lived in the specific river in your specific valley. They were, in a word that gets used too loosely but fits here exactly, local, radically, fiercely, sometimes catastrophically local. The individual tribe mattered more than the abstraction of a unified Celtic nation. The specific chief mattered more than the theoretical advantages of a high king who could coordinate everyone. This is why Caesar could march through them, because the Belgae wouldn't help the Arverni, and the Aedui would actually ally with Rome against their Celtic neighbors, and Vercingetorix's great coalition, magnificent as it was, came 20 years too late. But this same quality, this attachment to the specific, the local, the particular, is also what gave Celtic art its character. Celtic art doesn't deal in the universal and the ideal the way Greek and Roman art does. There are no perfect marble bodies in Celtic art, no idealized abstract forms in the Greek tradition of philosophical beauty. Celtic art deals in the specific and the alive. This animal, with this curl of muscle, and this particular way its tail loops back on itself. This vine, with this specific pattern of growth. This face, which is not any face but a particular face, strange and particular. The Latin artists, working in gold and bronze, in iron and coral and amber, covering swords and shields and drinking vessels and jewelry, with their swirling, breathing, living patterns, were rendering a world that was irreducibly specific. The world as it actually is, not the world as it ought to be. That habit of mind survived too. It survived in the Irish literary tradition, which has produced more great writers per capita than any comparable culture in history. And those writers, Swift, Wilde, Shaw, Yeats, Joyce, Beckett, Heaney, share a quality that is hard to name but recognizable once you see it. A preference for the concrete over the abstract, the immediate over the theoretical, the specific detail that carries a whole world inside it. Joyce didn't write a philosophy, he wrote Ulysses. A single day in a single city, so precisely rendered that people still walk the streets of Dublin on the 16th of June to trace the path of Leopold Bloom. Because the specificity of the place, the exact street, the exact pub, the exact quality of the light on the Liffey, that is where the truth lives. It's not a coincidence that the greatest novel in the English language was written by a man from an island that Celtic refugees held against the Roman world. The Celts were pushed to the edge of the world, and they went there. To the Western Islands, to the rain-soaked coasts, to the mountains and the bogs where the thin places gather, where the membrane between the living world and the other one goes gossamer, where you can hear things on a November night that you can't quite explain in the morning. They went there, and they stayed there, and they kept their languages alive by speaking them into the wind, kept their stories alive by telling them in kitchens and fields, kept their music alive by playing it at crossroads and in the dark after the guests had gone, kept their dead close by naming the places where those dead had walked, and building the new world on top of the old one, without pretending the old one wasn't there. There is a poem by the Irish language poet Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, written in the 1980s in a language that Rome couldn't kill. In it, she speaks of the other world as something that exists parallel to the ordinary world, pressing against it, available to those who know how to look. The poem is in Irish, the language that descended from the language the druids spoke in the oak groves of Gaul. the language that crossed the Irish Sea with refugees from a world the Empire was destroying, the language that was spoken in the bogs where men were given to the gods, and in the fields where the bonfires burned on the first night of November, and the dead came home. That language is still alive. The poem was written in the 1980s. That language is still alive. The poem was written in the 1980s. It is being written now, in classrooms and kitchens, and in the mouths of children in the west of Ireland who have never heard of Caesar and have never been to Rome. The Celts, remember, believed that death was not an ending, that the soul moved through, that what you were did not stop simply because your body stopped, that on the other side of the thin place there was something, abundance, rest, the feast that never ended, the music that never stopped, the faces of the people you'd lost, all of them younger, all of them well.
Whether or not they were right about that, the thing they carried, the languages and the myths and the art and the sense of the world is charged with something that doesn't quite have a name, turned out to be harder to kill than Rome expected. The druids are gone. The oak groves are gone. Anglesey is a tourist destination with a medieval castle. London, which Boudicca burned, is one of the largest cities in the world, built on top of the ash she left behind. But when you put on a costume on the last night of October, you are doing something that Celtic people were doing in fields lit by fire more than 2,000 years ago, on the edge of a world they believed was not the only world, calling across a thin place to whatever waits on the other side. The Celts never stopped being there. We just stopped listening for them. If this story stayed with you, if you're still thinking about it, that's exactly why I do this. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and drop your city in the comments. I genuinely want to know where in the world you're watching from.